especially for accidentally stepping on my biscuit shoes, a cardinal sin. After leaving the club, I'd return to the workplace where I'd kick back until my shift was over. Though I worked 12-hour shifts, there was no way I stayed there the entire time. When I wasn't partying on the company lot, I simply unmuzzled the dog and let him run loose, then vacate the premises and return a few hours before I clocked out. There was nobody there to hassle me or to report to, so I had free reign. Once, while I was on my way to work, I saw a bunch of cop cars parked around the building, so I made a U-turn to drop my rifle off at my friend Janice's house and then return to work. The strikers had discovered who I was and snitched to the cops about us packing weapons. Earlier that day, the cops mistakenly arrested this guy Brbr. Years later, he would end up on San Quentin's death row, who didn't remotely resemble me. But after that episode, there were no more run-ins with the strikers. They never crossed their side of the picket line. It was reminiscent of the 1920s when big companies hired the mafia or other thugs to guard the property against strikers, who seemed quite tame to us. Crips were hired to work because no one else wanted to deal with the hostile workers. For us, it was easy money. Within a matter of weeks, I purchased a clean, gold 1970 Cadillac with spoke rims. Cruising around Compton with a nice-sized afro, I was unrecognizable, but I still traveled with a weapon for security. Ever since I was a counselor, I purchased all of my weapons legally and kept the ownership documents in my wallet to avoid going to jail, I hoped. The law states that a legal gun owner can carry a gun in the vehicle as long as it's not loaded and the gun and bullets are carried separately. The gun or bullets had to be in the trunk or somewhere inside the car, but never together. To some cops, the documents didn't make any difference. They take me to jail on general principles just to have the papers authenticated. In South Central, the simplest of civil rights are lost at the moment of birth for blacks, even when you are confronted by an authority figure of the lowest status. Working at the beer distribution plant was easier than being a counselor. I didn't expect to hold a job for too long. Somehow, I would deny myself prosperity, or fate would do the same. There was an incident where one of Wayne's mother's female friends had argued with me over the smaller paycheck I received from her. I was told later that the dispute had more to do with her affinity for me, which I didn't reciprocate, rather than the payroll check. When I was kicking back at work, the woman showed up with her husband and several cop cars and escorted me off the premises. So I packed up the few scattered weights and drove away. Back in the duplex, my morning routine began with puffing on a sherm. Then I prepared for whatever the day would bring. I lived in three worlds. There was the real world that I didn't fathom, the violent gang world, and the illusionary world of intoxication, where past vulnerabilities were suppressed, where I was the man of steel living in a fool's paradise. I spent all that time indulging in the frivolity of drugs and becoming a sherm addict. During my mind-altering experiences, I slapped longtime friends Bimbo and Mansion, broke a broom handle over Eddie's head, and was said to have attacked many others for no apparent reason. Not too many people wanted to be around me because I had become unpredictable. There were episodes when I'd waddle in dirt, go down on all fours, and challenge a vicious dog, bark for bark and growl for growl, through a fence. I was on the brink of insanity. When I wasn't tripping out, I was chasing after women like a dog in heat. Calhoun used to show up bright and early, all excited about us going out to scour the west side for available women. One sunny morning, he showed up talking about how we'd go to Southwest College, where the campus was full of beautiful black women. After we puffed on some sherm, I was raring to go. I went through my usual ritual of oiling up my yokes just in case I needed to break out in front of the women. When we arrived, the college looked deserted, and I asked Calhoun what was up with this madness. He assured me everybody was in class, but at lunch I'd get an eyeful. In the meantime, we strolled down the hill toward one of the tiniest gyms I had ever seen. For kicks, I worked out alongside some of the football players who asked if I was planning to go out for football practice. I responded, "And what? Mess up this beautiful body?" Calhoun almost fell to the floor laughing. Before I left the gym, I gave a few of them some pointers on how to build up their arms. Then we were out of there. As we were walking up the hill, I saw a small crowd of men and women walk by, and all of them were thick and shapely. A black man sometimes chooses a woman in the image of his mother in hue and stature. Perhaps that's why the beauty of this female caught my eye, not to mention her tiny waist. As we passed, I turned and smiled, then complimented all of them on how they looked that afternoon. They smiled and giggled. We reached the grassy area in front of the college. It was packed. A music box was blaring out Marvin Gaye's song, Gotta Give It Up. I didn't have to scan the crowd because I already chose the voluptuous beauty I wanted. Calhoun, knowing the catch action was good, urged me to break out, but I told him it was all about timing, to be patient. Minutes later, with the sun beaming, I sauntered over to an area where I couldn't be missed. I slid out of my shirt and started flexing my muscles. The moment I started making my chest jump to the beat of Marvin Gaye's song, women started ululating and clapping like they were at a Teddy Pendergrass concert. After flexing, I made a beeline to my female of choice, who had been ogling me. I introduced myself to the woman. Hello, my name is Stanley Williams, but my mother, relatives, and close friends call me Tookie. Her eyes widened. You're Tookie? I answered. I sure am. Her name was Michelle. She told me her brother was Michael, who was known as a hustler and was in a wheelchair, paralyzed, having been shot for gambling with loaded dice, according to the story. It was awkward when she talked about all the horror stories she'd heard about me, especially when she asked if I remember when some crazy Crip homeboys and I trashed her mother's apartment during a late night party across the street from the golf course on Western. She talked about how different dudes she knew described me as being bald-headed and muscle-bound, with scars all over my face. They told her I was mean, ugly, and always jumping on people, she said. You don't look anything like they said, and you don't appear to be mean. After a lengthy, pleasant dialogue, we exchanged phone numbers, and I promised to call her late that day. Calhoun and I then left. When I called Michelle that evening, she sounded downhearted. Her mother disapproved of her having anything to do with me and didn't want me calling the house because she knew exactly who I was. Michelle told me she cried for hours, pleading with her mother to allow me to call the house, and she claimed her brother Michael cried alongside her in an attempt to change their mother's mind. Her mother finally approved of my calling. Floating on Sherm, Calhoun and I arrived at Michelle's mother's. Michelle's mother was beautiful and gracious, and not once did she bring up the madness of my past. I met Michelle's stepfather, her sister, Nunu. I'd been surrounded by him and some of his homeboys. At that time, he stood there with a blackjack in his hand trying to question me about his run-in with his brother. A run-in his brother had with my homeboy Bimbo. Whatever Lewis and his cronies' intent may have been, it was foiled with the realization that Buddha and 20 of my homeboys were observing. The misunderstanding immediately disappeared. Lewis eventually began hanging out with Melvin and his crew. A decade later, Lewis's younger brother Michael would claim untruthfully to be a founder of the Crips. Odd that Michael would make such a bogus claim. His brother Lewis became a Crip before he did. The checkered history between me and her family members didn't stop Michelle and me from hooking up. Though I was able to hide my addiction from her for many months, she heard vivid accounts from others of my drug escapades. Like the time Blackie and I visited the Coolie Cools, the notorious Inglewood apartments, nicknamed Sherm Alley, with his two giant stone statues of African heads in front. Blackie's car was parked in the middle of the street with the motor running as I jumped out, mobbed a drug dealer, and pummeled him to a bloody pulp. Then before a cheering crowd, I held a shopping cart overhead and slammed it down on the guy several times. The cops had a warrant for my arrest, but the guy regained consciousness after his coma and refused to press charges. To Michelle, the story was untrue, but for me it was real. My troubled life was a maze of contradictions that rendered me a hypocrite of the highest order. Absurdly, I believed that I could maintain a job and smoke sherm simultaneously. I began working again as a counselor for a boys' home near West Hollywood on Normandy Avenue. The two-story home was an ideal place for youngsters to try to get their lives back on track, far removed from the urban tapestry of gang propaganda. Though there was racial diversity in the home, there was only minor conflicts that made my job less hectic. Serving as a live-in youth counselor had its challenges. Sometimes when I was too high to drive home, Michelle would stay, keep me company, and then leave early in the morning. Other times Calhoun showed up and we drive iron, then puff away on some love leaf, marijuana dipped in PCP. Love leaf caused more blackouts, amnesiac incidents than sherm. One evening, prior to taking a shower, I entered the living room where counselors and youths were watching TV. Wearing a pair of boxer shorts, stoned out of my mind, I demanded that they look at me. I'm beautiful. I then pounded my fist on the big wooden dining table, splitting it in half, causing everyone to run out of the house. Then I went outside in the middle of the street and tried to pull people out of their cars, ranting and raving like a madman. I remember none of this. When I snapped back into reality, I found myself standing in the shower. After I dried off, I heard cops calling my name on the bullhorn. When I opened the door, there were cops everywhere pointing guns and ordering me to walk toward them. I was then handcuffed and placed in the back seat of the patrol car. On the freeway, I asked the cops what was the problem, and one of them told me, "Just relax, Tookie. The doctors are going to take good care of you." Drifting in and out, the next thing I knew, I was in the Metropolitan Hospital, strapped to a gurney, being intravenously given some kind of drug. The next day when I came to, I was sitting in a day room chair, wearing a quasi-straight jacket. Then, to make matters worse, I was sandwiched between a white guy in a hospital gown who rapidly recited, "Do you remember me? Do you remember me?" And on my left, a Latino woman who gently stroked her face, saying, "Pretty, pretty, pretty." I figured I was still high on love leave and that this nightmare would end in a minute. Nearby, a female was singing a country western song and some guy was swatting at imaginary objects. A black fellow was tap dancing and other people were walking around like zombies. It still didn't register that I was in the loony bin. It was a scene right out of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Then a black guy hollered out, "Tookie." This stranger launched into a dialogue about knowing who I was and said that he knew Raymond too. He said, "Tookie, you've been living a wicked life. It's time for you to stop and repent. Bow your head and pray with me, my brother." He babbled on for several minutes about revelations, fire and brimstone, then digressed into pleading that I allowed him to join the Crips so he could help purge the world of the brims. This had to be hell. I was unable to silence these characters whose unified front was to antagonize what little bit of sanity I had left. I believe it was 2 days later when I sat in the day room waiting to see the resident psychiatrist. Then, reappearing like incubi, were the same three figures I thought were part of the earlier hallucination. No longer in a straitjacket, I still felt disoriented. As I headed toward the restroom, moving with great difficulty, I was escorted by three irritants. While standing and relieving myself, the self-professed black preacher stood off to the side preaching. The white guy kept restating the phrase, "Do you remember me?" The long-haired female stroked my face, saying in repetition, "Pretty." I was escorted into a psychiatrist's office where he asked questions about my drug use. I denied ever using drugs and stated that someone must have spiked my protein drink with LSD or something. I told him I was a bodybuilder and that getting high would destroy my chances of becoming a professional. When he started asking me weird questions about whether I'd ever had sexual relations with my mother, sister, and aunts, I almost exploded. Instead, I countered, "Have you ever gotten a blowjob from your mother?" Unfortunately for him, I was physically incapable of reaching across the table and slapping the taste out of his mouth. I noticed whenever I was seated before a white voodoo doctor, his analysis of me would center on either a personal demon or an occupational trend based on his psychosexual standpoint. Perhaps my expression of scorn and silence convinced the doctor to change the subject. He didn't see why I should be kept there any longer. When I responded with a yes, he gave me the phone and exited the office. I contacted Michelle and Jackie, and later they picked me up. Having floated into the Metropolitan Hospital, I just as easily floated out, untransformed, with no reconciliation of my divided life.